Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone who is more, less, or other than those things, this is Layman Pascal on the Integral Stage, hosting Higher, Deeper, and Stranger Perspectives, and today bringing you our so-called Global Voices series. We know that we're supposed to be world-centric, planetary, transcultural integrators, etc., but in practice, we behaviorally default to our own spheres of cultural knowledge, our own languages, the influence of our own particular heredities, the unique sets of local tensions and narratives that we're constantly exposed to. And ultimately, that leaves out a lot of richness and renders us somewhat blind to the actual diversity that we hope to integrate productively. So in order to start walking our planetary talk, Bruce Alderman and I have convened this series to speak integrally, or at least at some kind of meta-liminal emergent level, about experience, politics, mood, culture, issues, history, and concerns coming in from the manifold regions of the earth and its great varieties of inhabitants. And why not? We clearly can't trust our legacy news media to tell us what's going on, so let's start figuring things out by asking people we trust. Here's someone I trust. Joining me today, the fabulous Fabionar himself, Mark the Rako Shark, if indeed that's a thing, to help us and help me learn a little bit more about how meta-level culture relates to Pacific indigenous cultures in his experience, and maybe also to explore how turquoise is the new purple. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Layman. It's good to hear you and see you. Are we being seen or just heard here?
It'll be both.
Well, okay, good to know.
We'll do it.
Yeah, shark. I haven't heard Mark the Shark, but I'll take it. My dad was a pool shark back in the day. When that's a true story, and one we don't have to get into, but it conjures up that memory.
I guess there's a lot of different ways to get into this conversation. Bruce and I had some discussion about where or even whether this fits into the Global Voices project, but somehow we both felt that it did. Yeah. Maybe you could give us a sense of how you got involved in working with indigenous cultures on the West Coast.
Yeah, that's a good question. My background, I'm mostly Filipino. Filipino and Swedish, and I grew up in Central Valley in California. And my folks on my mom's side, the lineage of my mom's side is really strongly connected to, goes back to the southern region of the Philippines, the Boholano, Askaya people and tribes. And so there was something about, without knowing when I was younger, that kind of tradition and history and culture that came from those people that found its way in California, that helped hold the community culturally in terms of how we came together. And that was an orientation around a type of collectivism, a type of connected to the land, connection to land, orality and storytelling, relationship with elders, that was more honoring of the wisdom and the lived experience of elders. So I mean, the orientation to that, even growing up in California, was there before I realized how much that was really influenced by traditional indigenous ways of being. And I'd say when I was in college at the University of California, Santa Cruz, I was involved in all kinds of different types of activism, including around indigenous rights and third world rights, and did a lot of cultural work, playwriting, directing. And a friend of mine, we co-wrote a play. It was mostly his work, called Crocodile Dreams. And in Crocodile Dreams was about the tension between indigenous ways of knowing within the Philippine diaspora and indigenous Filipino cultures, the reclamation of that, as a lot of young folks are doing and continue to do at this time, in tension with modern ways of living. And that opened up things for me when I was, when I was a young person, and as time went on, started to work more closely with indigenous peoples in California, indigenous peoples outside of California, mostly early on through education access to community college, higher education, including working with some of the Chumash in Central Coast, Coast Miwok here, and in Pomo, where I'm at in Sonoma County, making sure that there's spaces for them in higher education for them to have access to some of the resources and the learnings, as well as spaces for their own storytelling and wisdom traditions. And so that's how it started early on.
Okay.
A lot of words in the morning.
What's your sense? I mean, we circulate in a lot of communities where people play around with these developmental stage metaphors for individual development and cultural development. So there's a lot of discussion about green, postmodern, pluralism as something that's really useful, but also something we need to transcend. What's your sense of how that set of cultural approaches and insights is showing up in healthy or unhealthy ways? Like how much healthy green and unhealthy green are you seeing in these communities as they try to heal themselves and grapple with the problems of modernity that we're all facing?
I mean, there's a lot of healthy aspects to it, and there's a lot of things that are a bit frightening a little bit to some extent. Frightening is a tough word, but it's, things I think we need to be discerning about. I mean, the language that comes from postmodern critique of modernity around voices and perspectives and inclusion is still really important. I was this past weekend, the other day, I was with the Tulalip tribes up where, I think near where you were from originally, and near Seattle area. And talking with some of the leadership there, particularly in the field of education, and it's stories that I've heard before, and have friends and family members before, in terms of the ways in which the violence of modernity, the lack of access, the fragmentation, the internalized oppression or racism, however we talk about it, has really impacted so many people. And I think from a theoretical perspective, when we talk about, stages of developmental worldview, it's easy to really say, oh yeah, that's just a narrative and a story that we hear all the time. And it's not, we just need to go beyond that. But when you meet people, or you of people who that's really impacting and continue to impact, and not only just individuals, but within communities, and where there's a tremendous amount of suffering and violence, knowing that we need to hear those stories and also find ways to bring the resources and do some of the corrective or healing work that is needed, so that we are more whole and more intact. That came through in the conversation with these wonderful educators and leaders within Tulalip. Is like, hey, they told me they lost 50 young people, I think, last year to various degrees of suffering and violence, that largely informed by the shadow of modernity, whether it's drugs or violence, or taking one's own life. And so that's just really real. And it's not to say that modernity and the conditioning of modernity hasn't impacted everybody, because it is, and that's the larger project in inquiry and experimentation in terms of how we heal collectively. And we know the challenges of it. We know the challenges of looking through the lens of stage development and kind of the postmodern worldview, in terms of fixating on a particular story or narrative about a marginality, not really looking at different ideas of how we heal, not looking across time in terms of how we understand how things emerge and develop. So it's something that I see a lot, and I think I've been really good about learning how to work with it in terms of the kind of more postmodern mind that exists within culture.
So you mentioned hearing a lot about a kind of induced self-slaughter of the young through addiction and suicide and the shadow side of modernity. What else do you feel like you're hearing a lot of in terms of integrating these voices? What are these voices telling you? What sort of common themes do you hear coming up a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been what's been good to see emerge within, we'll just say broadly, kind of the social justice equity movements that's so deeply informed by postmodernism, among other things, is the in the last 10 years, I'd say maybe a little bit less, a more recognition of the need for health and vitality and healing. And a lot of that centered on the language of trauma and multi-generational trauma, and an understanding that in really order to heal or even decolonize or move forward in terms of the type of liberatory vision that a lot of folks have, and I'm speaking, broadly and generally, but I think it's true that we need to do our healing work. We need to find whatever modalities and communities and supports that we need to do the type of healing so that we have more energy, we have more spaciousness to envision what is new. So I think that's something that I think has been really gratifying and exciting to see, coming from the integral / human potential, / kind of different healing lineages that exist in my family. I know that was something that we always talked about in terms of different types of transformative practices. And it's not that these transformative practices or healing practices don't exist within minoritized or edge communities and indigenous communities. They're there. Just, I think there's a reclamation and of those, and a centering, as folks say, of those types of practices, so that they're brought up more. They're validated and legitimized more. So I think that's one thing, is the healing that I think is really really important. The return to kind of the land-based connection, and a type of respect for indigenous wisdom traditions, broadly defined. Wanting to come back and connect to land, wanting to learn certain skills and crafts, that we might connect to homesteading or indigenous ways of living, broadly defined. I think that's something that's been really positive and coming out and continuing to grow in terms of some of the land transition, ethical land transition, land justice stuff. So I think that's been pretty, a lot of that's been really, really healthy. Not always the frame in which people talk about it. But overall, in terms of, what I'm seeing is, I think it's been really good and important this time.
The craft piece and the sort of working directly with the resources of the natural environment piece seems like something that the broader developmental or wisdom community attempts don't have enough of, right? It seems like it's something that maybe they have to offer in terms of emphasizing those aspects.
I believe so. I remember getting in a little bit of a debate at one time with Russell Means, who was one of the leaders of the American Indian movement, and we brought him to do a conversation at one of the universities I work with, and we were talking over dinner. He's a formidable, passionate man, an intense man, and definitely shaped by not only his community, but the community of the 60s and the baby boomers, in terms of like, this is what is needed. And this is a while ago. I mean, this is maybe 15, 20 years ago. And he was really critical of our generation and the Gen Y, as, you all don't know what you're doing, and you're not engaging in movements in the right way. And we got in a debate, and I said, well, we're coming of age during this time of an explosion of information that's coming from cable, let alone the internet, and this thing called Facebook that was just, bubbling up. I said, and there's such a, even at that time, an intensity of who do we trust? What do we trust in terms of information? What do we trust in terms of what is healthy? What do we trust in terms of movement? Folks who are involved in movements, indigenous and otherwise. I said, and it's going to take some time for our individual and collective nervous systems to settle down and orient to people and practices that we trust. And so, luckily it didn't end with me getting popped on the head a little bit, because but I'm bringing this up because there's something very, very, as and as I think many people know, there's something very grounding about being outside, and there's something very grounding about, learning to work with your hands and to either cook something or plant something or weave something, and to do that, with somebody who's guiding you in a particular craft, and doing that, in closer proximity to nature, which means, closer proximity or embodiment with our own bodies, so that we can experience, nature, so to speak, in a different way. And that's trustable. That's, I mean, and it's disorienting at first, because especially now we want to see what's on Netflix. We want to, we want to swipe, or all these different things. But there's something, if the space is created, there's a remembering of that. There's definitely remembering of that once some of the conditioning is cleared and it's held in a certain way, and that's trustable. I find a lot of people, regardless of their politics, finding that really, really trustable and even exciting.
We have a sort of we associate indigenous cultures with an intergenerational kind of attitude. And we're all collectively standing in front of some radical generational shifts mediated by the kinds of technologies we're using, right? So that especially the wireless digital network systems now that are so engaging and so powerful, they're changing our brains and they're changing our social expectations. Is that causing, in your experience, does it look like it's causing a disruption with the intergenerational lineage that comes into these communities, or is it somehow turning people back toward those things?
I think maybe, both. That's sorry to give the Layman, both and answer, but it kind of really is. It's especially when you think of things like Facebook, where you can find your people and you can learn about intergenerational connections and both the gifts and shadows of different generations that come through, that we experience through our own body and community. You could find that. You could find your people. You could find your memes. You could find those stories. But you could also find the ones that that don't care about any of that. I also think about. I think a lot about popular culture and culture productions and the wealth of shows and stories that are coming through all these platforms of streaming. And you do, one of the things I'm seeing, I remember watching 3 different shows not too long ago that were, one was a Marvel show, and another one was kind of a dramatic comedy, and the third one was kind of an artsy cartoon. I don't know, I'm blanking on the word. And so they're very, very different, but they all dealt with intergenerational dynamics and healing, even though they were very, very different. And I watched those shows within a week of each other. And so there's something in the zeitgeist about wanting to connect, with a broader and a deeper story of who we are. There's a yearning for that in culture, because so much of that has been erased by modernity or hijacked by modernity, including these technologies that you're talking about. That we're talking about, and there's so much other content and ish that is out there that does distract us and take us away, from our bodies, where we have a deeper knowing and connection to, or can have a deeper knowing and connection with intergenerational ways of knowing. So it's both. I'm finding it both. I'll say that one of the projects I'm working on right now is. We'll call it an extended rite of passage, or an immersive residency for young adults within a given region, where they're, these young adults in their 20s live together, they work together on retreat spaces, and they come from the same region. And we're talking about the language of innovation, how doing that, working, deepening their connection with themselves, deepening their connections with others, and deepening their connections with land and place and nature is really innovative, and that type of innovation is not separate from the material, digital, technological innovation that comes from the scientific worldview, but it's one that I think needs to be held as primary, held as, reminded, like how important these types of more sacred technologies, if we want to call it that, or social technologies in terms of processes are in relationship to the other in place. And then we situate, and this is the intent at least, we situate the innovation and the insight that comes from digital technology within that broader context of what innovation is, and we're hoping that the experience of connection and healing, cross-culturally informed by indigenous wisdom, but not centering that as a language, give something to the body mind that's more compelling, more healthy, and less addictive than the things that are coming from digital technology and platforms today.
I really appreciate you calling that out as innovative, because I think there's a tendency in communities that are focused on the leading edge to think that leading edge is somehow just futuristic technology and maybe becoming or something like that. But there's a leading edge in dreams. There's a leading edge in plants. There's a leading edge in how we talk to each other, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it's, it's such a, we're intentional in naming our institute Innovative Learning and Living Institute, and having learning, living, and innovation, a part of that, because, and so much of it is to at least in the name, is to deepen and expand the notion of what innovation is, and then, and then offering, even in the conversations I had with some folks in tech, who were bringing on board to this project. It was like, we're really at the intersection of innovation from that's scientific, social, and sacred, and we really, really mean it. Not that these three are separate, but sometimes we have to separate it to make it distinct in terms of how we conceptualize this term innovation, as and it's I think it's a way that we're both, and this is the kind of the liminal, transitionary moment in terms of playing with words and signifiers. Is like, innovation is something that resonates a lot in the West and definitely in the U.S. And so let's positively appropriate that term, so that we want to really, really work with it, because we know that there are other types of innovation that come from what Groff and others call technologies of the sacred. All the things that many folks in integral or human potential movement, and then even before that, indigenous communities, traditional communities have been doing for centuries, and that's is being called for. There's the innovation that comes from, liberating structures. What types of processes are we doing in groups, whether it's intersubjective practice or we space, or it's some other type of configuration where we're harvesting the insight that comes from the collective, or creating, as Carter Phipps didn't name this, make this term, but I know he's doing a lot of research and writing about it, or I think he will be doing some writing about it. I'm not like revealing anything I shouldn't. But there's but genius, the kind of the scene where genius comes through, that it's not something that's just individualistic, and that type of reclamation of innovation that includes and goes beyond indigeneity, indigenous wisdom tradition is super important this time.
You mentioned I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I grew up on a very rural kind of island, back to the land community, working the land, hanging out in the cedar trees, hunting. So I have a lot of sympathy to that part of the world and to that kind of lifestyle. My dad was he worked on a native fish boat, salmon fishing, when I was a kid in Salish and Lekwungen and Kwakwakwa territories. So I'm curious about your work with the Salmon Nation project, and maybe you could give us a little sense of what that's all about.
Yeah, that was that has been and continues to be exciting. I mean, I know that there's been so many different understandings and experience around salmon people, Salmon Nation, and the project itself, or the different projects or expressions of essentially saying, hey, we really, really need to honor the bioregion and the wisdom that comes from the land, and including the watersheds and the salmon and the ways in which people are fed, and if we don't do that, we're in big trouble. And some of that is a reclamation of these different tribes and wisdom that comes from these tribes that are more aligned with the spirit of the salmon and the salmon people. I got brought into this project, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, by Edward West, who's known to many folks in the integral community. He's a social entrepreneur and a wonderful, wonderful being. And he invited me to have a conversation with some of the co-founders of this vision called Salmon Nation, which essentially is redefining, place in accordance to bioregion, nature state instead of nation state, the eventual, evolution to nature state, and not nation state. And so we convened, I don't know, maybe 50 of us in Sitka, Alaska, and these are different change agents, thought leaders, people who are doing really interesting work, not just, a number of them from different indigenous tribes from throughout Alaska all the way down to the Bay Area, which is kind of the what Salmon Nation is, and then according to how the salmon flow and according to the bioregion, the watersheds. And the idea was to say, hey, let's just reclaim, let's claim this land in a different way. Claim, probably not the best word in the context of we're talking about. Let's rethink and repractice and offer a new vision and story of what this land is and this place is, that is healthier. And so you have folks who are there who work with salmon. You have folks who work on ranches. You have folks who work in finance, and kind of are looking at the future of wealth and value exchange. You have folks who are tech folks. You have artists. You have artisans. You have people who have PhDs, so to speak, in making canoes and woodworking. And it's like let's really tell these stories of these different folks throughout the region who are much more aligned with indigenous wisdom, place-based learning, and different transformative practices, and grow this network and ecosystem with this reclaimed story of what Salmon Nation is and could be. And that's been really powerful and potent, and like anything new that is bringing together people from diverse perspectives and worldviews, challenging. And so my work has been doing some work around land listening. That's part of some of the some of the skill set that I have that comes from a couple of different wisdom traditions that I've been initiated into. Some of my work is around healing and bridging between those folks in Salmon Nation who are really adept at working with wealth, and while they have a deep understanding and a deep connection with a lot of indigenous folks, and some of them are indigenous themselves, are struggling with some of the younger generations who are really embedded in what we might call the postmodern activist worldview. And so there's a tension even within this new, visionary, experiment, broadly speaking, a clash of worldviews that exist even within, a broad-based movement or vision. So I've been brought in to help translate, to help mediate, to do some process consulting, and sometimes explicitly to do some healing work. And so that's been my involvement. And right now we're talking about how we can bring some of the Salmon Nation folk to this project that I'm working on at the Whidbey Institute in Whidbey Island, in terms of some teachings and some framings, around place.
Last year in integral and metamodern circles, there was a lot of discussion about this Graeber and Wengrow history book, The Dawn of Everything.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting features of that book, or that caught my attention when I read it anyway, was this notion of schismogenesis, and how a lot of cultures had more options than we think of them as having, and sort of formed themselves to be different than their neighbors in various ways. And one of the differences they pointed out was the tendency of people in the Pacific Northwest, those tribes, to take slaves, but not to use currency, and the tendency of people farther down the coast to use currency and not take slaves. And currency and slaves aside, right, what's your sense of the differences in these regions? Because we're, Alaska, Washington, BC, California, Mexico, that's geographically pretty spread out. Now, I know there's a lot of commonality, but do you have a sense of how they differ?
Wow, that's a great question. And this is, and it's wow, that's a really good question. And in part because there's so much of the focus on the commonality. Because of the shared vision and hope for a more holistic, eco-indigenous way of being. I think there's the particularities. there's a lot of things that are coming to mind right now. So, there's I recently was invited to a conversation here in the Bay Area at Bolinas, California, on the coast, around basically ethical land transition, land justice, sacred contracts. And there were a number of Indigenous elders and leaders, and some folks who are funders and other folks who are process consultants, and in this conversation around how do we advance, healthy relationship with land and the liberation of land and people that's informed but not limited by Indigenous wisdom. And so I bring this up because, there were a number of folks from different, there were some folks from folks from the East Coast. There were some folks from the Mohawk. There were some folks from Hawaii, Indigenous from Hawaii. There were some folks who were Coast Miwok. There were a number of different folks. And while there was an alignment, definitely, and even a deep affection and hope and healing that came from that type of gathering, and there's also the challenges of people's particular protocols and metaphors, and how we do things in terms of the social and the spiritual realms. And that's kind of the clearest example I have without, is that, if you have somebody who's a land listener from a particular, tribe, and the land says, hey, you need to offer, this is what is wanted, and the offering is, ash, or it's tobacco, or it's meat, in order to harmonize, with the land. And somebody else who is also a land listener from a different tribe gets something else, and says, no, the offering is this, how do you begin to navigate and negotiate those type of particularities? And I'm using that just kind of as a really kind of, obvious example that speaks to the different types of cultural nuances that exist according to region. But that's how it shows up in the ways in which I've been connecting with these different groups, is around ritual, and how and protocol, and it's so intertwined sometimes with the pain of not being seen. Where we have certain Indigenous elders or people who maybe not elders who are being brought to a particular convening or conversation because they represent a culture and a perspective that's wanting to be heard. And I've been invited, so I want to share what's important. This kind of goes back to the question of the importance of the postmodern impact. It's like, hey, and you're bringing me here to offer my story and my wisdom, and I want to offer it. And I haven't been able to show it, tell it. So I got to make sure I get it in. And sometimes there's a lot of space that's taken up with that storytelling. And so how do you navigate that with other people who have the stories and the protocols and things that they brought in? So I think you get what I know you get what I'm saying, but I think that's kind of been my best, the thing that I'm noticing in terms of the differences. I mean, there's differences in terms of cosmology, in terms of story, but in terms of what I'm working on, how bringing people together to work on kind of translineage based projects, and visions, that's what I'm noticing is the protocols and the social dynamics I'm working in. And I think that's where some of my framing and work has been really valued in reframing and bringing people together. All right, Layman, I felt that was a little long and perhaps not specific enough, but that's.
No, that was great. I really appreciate that. I think the sense of the way that the different cosmological and imaginal and experiential backgrounds from the different regions have to negotiate with each other, both in terms of protocol and in terms of bringing their stories and visions and ideas and words through, when the background of that is a feeling like there hasn't been space for this, and maybe this is my only chance.
Yep.
How do you do that without slowing everything down for everybody?
Yeah. Well, and one thing, just to give an example, and there was a bit of an intervention that I made at this gathering, and framed as a story. And I said, Essentially, whenever I've done land listening or been brought in to do land listening, and we can learn to listen. We can either be graced in terms of the information that comes through in relation to place. We could either have that be developed by a particular lineage or type of training, or we can just spend time there and on land and just kind of be open. I mean, there's nobody owns land listening, and there is a subtlety to it, and there's a subtlety that can come from doing that work. I said, but essentially, there's three broad areas that we take a meta perspective is like, the land wants to be honored and adorned, the land is speaking to some type of need for a type of healing, healing work, both, on the land itself or within the communities that inhabit it, including the animals, or there's some type of novel project or novel creative works that's wanted to come in relationship with land and place. So those are kind of three, and there's a combination. There might be others, but those are kind of the main three things that come up. And so the frame was like, so the land wants to be adorned or honored, and you can honor it if your tradition says to honor it with ash and tobacco, then honor it. If it says to be honored with flowers or some other thing, shells, that's fine. But let's just hold the broader meta frame that this is done honoring, and that loosen things up a bit in terms of how we can see that that different cosmologies and protocols and materials in these ritual practices are all valuable, and that if we hold a broader frame, a meta frame, that's a way to bring them together. And so that's kind of some of the ways in which I've intervened, that has been richly informed by integrative theory, meta theory, and just living, quite honestly.
I just love that somebody is thinking about these things.
Well, clearly, our conversations with you're thinking about them and enacting them as well, and that's why it was so refreshing to talk to you the other day. And kind of our pre-conversation, like, oh man, I've been wanting to talk to you since ITC 2015. Just because I was like, who's this guy? He's I was very, very curious about you and your work for a long, long time. So I'm glad that we're connecting around there.
The land listening is so important, right? This sense of embodied imaginal resonance with the ecological elements and how that repatterns the way we hold our knowledge and our intuitions about the actions we should take. It seems really important to me to convene a much larger conversation around that from people all over the world as we collectively stand in front of ecological existential crisis.
Yep.
Let's hear from as many different kinds of land listeners as we can. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, say, setting up integral or meta gatherings, I'm involved in lots of discussions around setting these things up. What would you say is sort of would be like the number one thing for the people setting up an event to remember to keep it close to the wisdom of the land? I don't know if that question even makes any sense, but I feel like these events are emerging and they're not doing much land listening. Yeah.
Well, I think from kind of my orientation around these types of gatherings, from more kind of human potential integral gatherings are different than yours. I think because you've been much more involved in the metamodernism, conversations, even metamodernism and spirituality, and so that's, I could say with. I think with more kind of some of the integral communities, it's like, well, who's designing the convening? You know what I mean? Quite honestly, and this is not just a postmodern critique of the whiteness of integral. You know what I mean? That's valid and limited. As anything, but it's like, do you have folks who come from different traditions and or different capacities around land listening? Who instead of just saying let's go to a beautiful place that's inspiring, that holds us, in terms of type of a retreat work or which is all good and well, but it's a different and that might lend itself to a different type of land listing because we're closer to our bodies and our immediate physical needs and relational needs are more taken care of. So it's like, okay, drop in more. And but it's something different when you have somebody, you have some buddies who have a different types of orientation to land listing that are involved in the design, so to speak. It's so, I mean, like, and not to use myself. I mean, just for me personally, as an experience is like, one of the projects I'm working on, is looking at the future of retreat centers from an equity and regenerative standpoint, and I get brought in for, different perspectives, including ones around land listing and indigenous wisdom tradition. And so the project that I named earlier around these young adults living and working together on retreat spaces, to work on polarization and healing and cross-cultural, understanding, among other things. How we select where we have these things aren't just based on conversations we have with retreat center leaders. It's actually, where does the land want us? You know what I mean? And that's a big, as one inquiry amongst other inquiries around where we're going to be, and this is really, really important in terms of that kind of the different insights and informations that we take in and ways of knowing that inform our decision-making process, and I feel very fortunate to be working with colleagues and friends who value that type of listening and way of knowing in terms of where do we want to do our work. And so, through different practices and processes, it's like, yeah, we were wanted and we were invited to the Whidbey Island in this instance, to the Whidbey Institute and the land there, and in conversation with, the energies and activated in terms of the imaginal subtle conversations and practices, in addition to, how it comes through the people who live there, including the indigenous folk, the Tulalip and other folk, and the folks who are non-indigenous, and listening to how their relationship with land. So, I mean, it really is, I think of the one thing, this is a long story to get to the one thing, you have to bring people who are oriented to land listening in whatever ways, lineage or otherwise, that really have that and have that inform the design, the co-enactment, the things that we've all talked about in terms of, participatory epistemology and, all that type of co-enacting and stuff, and that you and Sean and others, write a lot about. Anyways, that's my long, short answer.
Yeah, thank you. When people get introduced to a developmental model, there's a tendency to hold it very simply because you're just trying to learn its basic elements. And in the simple version, there's this sense that there is an archaic, indigenous, tribal, very primitive zone, a little bit above cavemen, but below below nations, states, and kingdoms. Now, of course, we know that that's an insufficient oversimplification, but it still resides in a lot of our collective understandings.
Yeah.
What do you think the actually experiencing the richness of indigenous communities does to the way we hold the developmental stage model? What challenges does it bring? What tweaks does it suggest?
Oh man, that's such a beautiful question. I mean, that's such a beautiful question and so timely, Yeah, I mean, I think at the very least, we know that we understand the critique of it, the critique of the stage model, and who, and the ways in which, those have been researched, or theorized, I think that's the immediate thing. I think it's you enter into such a rich, nuanced, and potentially liberatory space when you really engage. You're invited in and you engage, cultures, indigenous and otherwise, where you're living and you're interacting, and you get a sense of the life conditions, you get a sense of the context, and then you get a sense of the language and the metaphors that are guiding folks and constellating and informing their cosmology. and once you do that, and this is, and a lot of us don't do this because we don't spend years, in deep communion with indigenous communities. And, and I'm not saying that I do this, but it's in a deep extended way, but I have connected enough to know, it's so reductive and so violent, and I think this is the critique that, Nora Bateson and others who are critical of stage theories. And I think there's some point, it's like, it's so reductive to take that type of meta perspective and say, oh yeah, that's just this, and not just, that's just tribal, archaic, indigenous people across the world, across time, and that's what's really important is their gifts and their shadows, and and that's all it is, without really entering into and being in relationship with the ideas and practices and languages and metaphors and life conditions that give forth to their ways of knowing. So it really is, it's painful, quite honestly. It's been painful. My orientation to a lot of understanding of stage theory came from spiral dynamics, and it came from working really close with Don Beck and others, and deep training, which a lot of things in those trainings and conversations get lost through the YouTube videos and the articles and the ways in which people get overly conversant with the colors and basically the kind of modern appropriation of stage development theory that's very violent, can be very violent and scary. It still hits me even when I talk about it, because it's, but one of the things that I really appreciated about Don, and Don, as many folks know, was a complex, a complex being with a lot of gifts and a lot of shadow. He would say, working with the Zulus or working with different indigenous communities, like there's like tremendous amount of gifts and capacities, and wisdom, wisdom there that we don't want to, that people basically don't understand and know unless they're living amongst them with them. And that shifts the way that we see things, including how we see development. And it's, I wish I was more articulate in terms of that, but it's something that it pains me. It really pains me the way in which things get reduced to, oh, that's just tribal way of knowing. That's just that's archaic. And I think there is some truth, in my experience, some truth to some of that way of identifying certain markers of culture and value systems and worldview. But I think so much richness is missed, so much so that I think this is why, and you and I chat about this earlier, why the wisdom of the earth and the indigenous wisdom is bubbling up through a different worldviews, because it's so needed. The insight that is needed, that is healing, that is more intact. When we talk about indigenous communities, intact communities, how do we become more intact now that we are fragmented? How do we what are some of the guidance and the wisdom and the ways of being that can come from indigenous communities without romanticizing the archaic past? And that's I don't know. That's my best answer right now for that question. It's a really powerful and important question, and I think it really boils down to how epistemology, and which epistemology do we pay attention to, and how does that shape our map making? What do you think? Let me. What do you think around this? I feel like I know that there's a there for you, and I just to give us a little taste, because it's. When you ask that question, there's so much that comes up in my emotional subtle body around the violence that comes from stage theory, and at least the storytelling around how we do it. Not that it's not important, but I kind of got lost in some of the trauma in my own body around that, quite honestly.
Yeah, there's so many different ways to come at a question like this.
Yeah.
One of them is clearly to relate very deeply to the violence that's inherent in the modern appropriation of stage development, and to question whether, as Nora does, even if there's an increasing body of knowledge about how these different structural developments unfold in beings, how useful is that, right? Is holding that helpful enough that it's worth the risk of its misuse?
Yeah.
Can we put it all aside and just sort of develop the skills of dealing with whatever's in front of us in a developmental fashion? trying to unfold whatever we're with. And that sounds safer, right? It sounds to me like, but everything is like that, right? Tools are dangerous. The cell phone is dangerous. You can use it, but you should be on guard. It's not your friend. So that's sort of how I feel about developmental stage theory. I think one of the most important things for everybody to remember is that there's a difference between existing indigenous communities and what we think of as the indigenous past. And contemporary communities are full of every kind of stage that you could imagine. And also that both the contemporary and the historical notion of indigenous communities problematize the tidiness of the developmental model. So there's many different ways that those stages showed up and many different pathways of transition, and things came and went and fluctuated. And some of the problems we may be facing now might have been solved by people we think of as primitive. Doesn't mean there's no place for developmental enfoldings, but it's just a lot more organic and rhizomatic and complex than we've thought.
Agreed. Thank you. So you just, you go right to it. And I, here's me talking. I got to do the host thing here. I got to quickly sum it up and move on. No, good. I get it, man. I get it. I appreciate it.
Another thing that was coming up for me was, so a lot of integrative type thinking has a place for different states or different realms, gross, cuddle, subtle, causal, non-dual. And when we think about the subtle, it's usually something like a spectrum that runs from the astral to the vital, or the imaginal to the bioenergetic. And when we think of the bioenergetic, we often think about the East. We think of chi and prana and those elaborate psychotechnologies of subtle body energy sensing. When we think of indigenous cultures, we often think of the more imaginal component. We think of them having sophistication with dreams and conversations with the ancestors and visions and symbolism. But what have you found around their work with subtle energies, with the sort of bioelectric sensing? Or do you find those conversations going on? Do people talk to you about that in those communities? Or is it sort of marginalized there, let's say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the way that you're framing it in terms of the subtle energies of the East, versus the subtle energies of of more kind of Western indigenous communities. There's more around the imaginal, the symbolic, but not all. But not always. I recently had was called to do some work with my family, some healing work with my family, some that I was asked to support in terms of some of my practices, but also to reach out to a woman who's trained in the Toltec, some of the Toltec healing traditions. And so last week, my parents and I went to spend time with her, and this was some really, really rich energy work that she does. That was both working with it was fascinating because it's something that I wasn't really familiar with, in that the chakra system, what we call kind of the equivalence of the chakra system, was really told through the story of different animal spirits, at different chakra systems, and that they were helping to clear or bring forth different types of energy, in the body. So clearing the energy that comes from old agreements or contracts, so to speak, that are no longer serving, that we're ready to release, and then bringing more kind of healthy energies and intentions into the body of these different vital centers. But they're really, really held by these spirit animals, and that was new for me, in terms of the storytelling. But I and my folks can feel the energy and the energy work that was going on with this particular healer, named Brenda Salgado, a really, really, really potent and beautiful being, beautiful sister. So that was, I think that kind of comes to my mind in terms of the way in which she was languaging the work, coming from the tradition that she was entrained and entrusted with. And the experience and both the experience and the storytelling around subtle energies was that, but also connected to the more mythic, symbolic storytelling that happens with a lot of indigenous communities. So that's kind of one thing that comes to mind. But I would say by and large, at least the communities I've been working with, the imaginal, the dream space, the symbolic has been largely privileged. Yeah, and if there's something around around the orientation to healing and subtle energy within I'm trying to remember. I'm blanking. I feel bad. I'm blanking on the particular tribe that this elder was from at a gathering a while ago, where she was invoking the different animal spirits in a particular ceremonial ritual context, but then she code switched, and I feel bad that I can't remember the tribe right now. This is one of the challenges of working with different communities together. She code switched to the language of energy, to the language of releasing emotion through the body. In addition to her working with these different spirit beings and calling in ancestors, and so that's how it's shown up more recently in terms of my engagement with some of these communities. And but I do find it kind of more what you're naming, the way that you kind of framed it in terms of the East and more Western ways of storytelling.
The question of elders, it's a really open question. And it's very important to me. And one of the ways it's important, I think, is, let's say, meta networks have to create a field together, and that field has to become instantiated, and that looks something like the creation of a meta tribe, liminal tribe, integral tribe, something like that. And part of that instantiation is figuring out relationships that are similar to some of the classical tribal relationships, including the elder status. Right. And so that means we have to ask ourselves not only how we relate to the elders, but who are they? Right? And so sometimes that's just a status you get, and sometimes there are old people, and old people need to be respected and cared for, but sometimes it's this other thing that goes, oh yeah, that's an elder. Right. So what do you look for? And having seen a bunch of people, you just named a woman as an elder a minute ago. What distinguishes an elder from just an older in your experience?
Yeah. No, that's the big question. It's an important question, I should say. Yeah, a few years ago, I helped convene at the university of all places, a 2-day event around indigenous wisdom and shamanism, and brought elders and practitioners from different parts of the world, from Korea, Mongolia, local folks here, from the Dagara tradition, all into to the university ballroom, amongst other things, And there was a lot of conversations around and tensions around elder, the notion of elder, and I think I and others talked about a distinction, and I think including Michael Brabant, who I think has written a little bit about this somewhere around the distinction between elders and olders, and that. For me, growing up, anybody who was older than me, I was taught to give them respect based on lived experience. It's like, hey, you respect your elders, and sometimes it didn't make sense because some of the people who are older than us, were doing things that they shouldn't be doing to, some a bit more violent than others. But it's like, okay, how do I deal with that expectation of working with, of giving respect to elders when I feel like, that certain people who are older than me aren't trustable, quite honestly, so how do I, where does that discernment come in, and this is essentially what you're asking. So making a distinction between olders and elders is important, and saying that there's due respect to people who are older because of lived experience, but it's a difference in terms of elders who are people who are trustable in terms of the wisdom which they inhabit and transmit, and some of the characteristics of that is the capacity to listen. Sometimes you just know, you just know by being in the presence of somebody, in a conversation, and what they share, and what they, for me, what comes up intuitively, but also how they show up in social spaces, and the questions they offer, and when they decide to come in, with a perspective. It's not taking over. It's really the timeliness in which they decide to show up, and the timeliness of of the perspective that they're offering. So that's, and this is not to romanticize even elders who are, who show up within a particular wisdom tradition in our lineage holders, because we all know that folks can have their shadow sides, even if they're elders, even if they're spiritual teachers, and we know that tremendously in the West and in the U.S. But I think making the discernment between the elders and what is trustable, and I think elders really give space for the unfolding of the larger community without feeling like they have to lead things all the time. And sometimes the elder comes from people who are younger. That's just and there's a knowing of that. There's a trustability. There's a trustability from the folks, and that this person is in service of the community or the communities that are coming together for a particular purpose. So that's the somewhat short answer. Of course, we can get really deep into what's trustable and groupthink and all that stuff, but I think the distinction between older and elder is really important.
Groupthink makes me think of identity, and identity is, in a non-dual sense, there's no limitation on any identity in terms of being transparent to what's greater than itself. Mm-hmm. But in practice, identity is kind of ambivalent in that sometimes it's liberating and sometimes it's a trap. And when we have this constant social conversation with some people saying, these are our ways, this is our land, we are this, where is that really useful and important as a function? And where is that a risk of just creating division and separation and locked down identities that prevent further unfolding?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, and this is, I think this is where the story, or some of the story around worldviews and stage development, has been really useful to me in terms of my own understanding of what you're naming, but also my own healing around some of the limitations that can come from being so part of one community, one group. I'm going to kind of, if some of the cultural practices and worldviews are held or held really, really tightly, or held as a closed system by the elders and the storytellers of a given community, that makes it hard for the youngers to stretch and grow and evolve. Evolve's a loaded word in this community, in this context, but to grow, to grow beyond and explore what is meaningful to them and their people in a way that might be seen as transgressive, and so that's, I think, that's an important lesson. I have a story around the kind of the emergence of the evolution of some of the Dagara practice in West Africa, in which I've been identified and invited into and gone through different initiations, but knowing that I'm practicing with these traditions and within this lineage here on Turtle Island here in the U.S., and where the land where the land is different, and the life conditions and the cultural context is different. And so the question, there's several questions, that come up, and one of them is around the appropriation of a tradition that I wasn't born in terms of the land, even though I was invited by the elders and the beings into this. But the other one is, how are we practicing this in a way that's in integrity with the tradition in West Africa, knowing that we're practicing in that here. And that touches on what you're talking about in terms of the practices that are indigenous to place, and the ways in which elders hold those, and how do you evolve them in a way that is in integrity with the lineage. And so that's this is what I've been really impressed by. Some of the folks who are community of practice within this particular tradition here in the United States, is that we're still in constant conversation with folks in West Africa and then elders and the ritual elders and the teachers there, and even dreaming together and listening to each other's dreams, and asking questions, and from us from the West, making sure that the resources are going back, to this. So it feels really the value exchange, not the value exchange, the value of being a community is really, really, really shared. But one of the things that I learned is then this is the limitation of the postmodern mind around how we essentialize, how ironically we can essentialize indigenous practices and worldviews as a fixed way of, this is the way that we need to go to, when the elders and practitioners of the Dagara, it's been really, really practical. It's they adjust the rituals and practices if things not working, because they have to, because it's a substance culture, and if the practices that are coming from the diviners or the healers and the rituals, aren't really, really making their lives better in terms of survival, in terms of relationship, then they'll adapt, and they have adapted, and they will borrow from other tribes and cultures to. So it is something that is always evolving and emerging, that's suiting a really practical need in terms of survival and community cohesion. And so that carries over here, kind of the diaspora of this community of practice, and then that if there's rituals that are being asked for particular animal offerings, that how have we evolved beyond that, so that in our modern Western tradition that the spirit of that is honored, but not but knowing that it's a different cultural context in terms of working with animals as ceremonially and ritually. And so I know this is a long story, but it really kind of gets at to what you're talking about, is that there's a dreaming that people who've been initiated and part of this community of practice here in the United States had around an alternative to blood offerings, where it was the infusion of hibiscus, and that showed up not only one person's dreams, but another person's dream. And they brought that back to some of the elders in West Africa. And they said, oh yeah, that's something that you could use, as an alternative to blood offerings. It energetically carries the same heft in terms of working in terms of ritual work. And so, that's the kind of the evolution of the ways in which a healthy example in which, elders and their stories and their practices are able to be spacious enough to say, yeah, that these traditions will continue to evolve and unfold in different places, but there's still an ongoing conversation of how those are innovated and unfold in relationship to place. So yeah, that's that was a long story. Sorry, Layman. but I think you understand why it's important to tell for so many different reasons, including the notion of appropriation, including the notion that the way in which we can romanticize the indigenous ways of being in terms of this tradition has been around for 9,000 years. Yeah, but it's like everything with culture. Like Lisa Lowe says, it's partly inherited, partly modified, partly invented. And so. But how we go through that process, in terms of the innovation, the shifting, and perhaps the evolution of cultural practices is it's about the how and not always necessarily about the what. All right, that was a lot of words, man.
That's good.
You're going to go back and edit that, or put that through some software that cuts out a lot of the
shorten it down to one sentence.
Right. Yeah.
9,000 years in Africa. These ideas put me in mind of some interesting thoughts. There's in modernity, under the conditions of scientific deep time and contemporary archaeology, we have this discussion. We're like, well, ultimately, we're all Africans, right? Is that a kind of discussion that comes up in indigenous communities? And what I really mean by that is to presence a bigger question about timeframes.
Yeah.
Right. When we're thinking about these communities, when we're thinking about lineages, what time frame do you find most of them working on? Are they working in a couple hundred years where North Americans met with Europeans? Are they working in the 10,000 years since the Ice Age, the 30,000 years in which maybe there was a primal superculture here, or the 100,000 years of anatomical humans? What's the most common, maybe the juiciest sort of time frame you find people engaging with?
It really, really varies. I mean, I think, in accordance, I mean, as you named before, there are different different experiences and worldviews that exist within an existing indigenous community. There's the diversity, uniformity that exists within a community. And sometimes I think the we're all Africans was part of a really important cultural nationalism, and that's been really useful for a number of Black folks from Black communities and African American communities as a healing and a reclamation of identity and a story that is really important. And there's some limitations to that, obviously for a variety of reasons I don't want to go into, but I mean, you hear a lot about 7 generations, in terms of that time frame, seven generations back, generations forward, in terms of what we're doing now to heal whatever conditionings in our bodies and our communities, so that we can begin to imagine or draw forth or attract the future for several generations. So that's one that's it's pretty much that's in a lot of the conversations zeitgeist, because I think it's familiar. Yeah, I really appreciated Bio Komalefe. Bio's a really beautiful liminal thinker who came out of so many different both indigenous and Western training, philosophy and psychology, and he talks about the thick now, right? He's he talks about the queerness of the thick now. He's like, it's past, present, future, all right, all right now, and it's a different orientation in terms of understanding and inhabiting, that type of that sense of time. And there are times where I understand that in a really, really deep level. And that can inform certain ways of operations and decision making. And there are times where, like many of us, when I'm contracting to the 3D modern linear time, where it's harder to really work with that, and depending on the people and the processes and the ceremonial practices. But I find that to be really, really, really useful, and even challenging some of the kind of even more linear ways that we talk about 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. But I think most of the time, people will talk about 7 generations, when I work with these communities, because I think it's mostly in the indigenous zeitgeist.
I guess we're coming near the end of this. It's a great conversation. I got the last thing I'd like to ask about is maybe just some emotionally valent stuff, like in working with these communities, what's the happiest and the saddest part? What do you find is really breaking your heart, and what do you find is really exciting you and giving you hope and curiosity and a sense of a future?
Yeah. One of the communities that I've been working with is a network of Filipino folks, indigenous, some non-indigenous Filipinos who are learning, and it came from a body of work from Lenny Strobel and her Center for Babaylan Studies, which is Filipino, healers or shamans that many of them are women, historically. And I was invited to go to a gathering, I think 2019, before the pandemic, in Canada, and it was so beautiful, and there were so many Filipino Canadians, indigenous Filipinos, other indigenous folk there, And what was beautiful about that convening is that it was organized largely by women who understood the importance of family and children being there, and not, and this is kind of a little bit to your earlier question of how do you design things around closeness to nature, but how do you design some things that really take in consideration what we're living as moderns. Many of us are moderns in terms of family and taking care of family and children, and there was such an aliveness to have multiple generations of kids running around, and it was held at an old YMCA camp. And so, it was we were outside, the kids were running around, there was different conversations around, what's being done in different tribes in the Philippines that is really, really useful, both in terms of the subtle practices, but the craft practices. And there was also conversations around what are we emerging into or evolving into as a diaspora that's connected, and informed by, modern technology, and all these different types of questions and tensions. But there was a lot of joy. And there was a lot of joy in coming together as, with families, and that's something that I haven't experienced much, maybe within existing community or tribe, so to speak, but not, when you're inviting many, many, many people. And that was that type of celebration and joy, I think, is really, really important, because I think we know the reckoning that is happening, and in which edge communities, indigenous communities, and other species have been the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, and all the violence that we kind of touched on earlier when we were talking about some to Layman, among others. That's heartbreaking and heartbreaking. I think of, I spent time with some folks at the Hawaiian homestead when I was younger, indigenous Hawaiian folk, and they just, one of them in particular just brought me in to the storytelling and the land and the practices when I was a kid. And he's just a beautiful, powerful, potent being in terms of the language, in terms of his access to the subtle and symbolic, in terms of his knowledge of so many things. And yet, because of colonialism and the shadow of modernity, there's the violence and the struggles and the addictions and the death that is also intertwined, within this being in this community. Is that, revisiting him, more recently, you could see how that's, that they're both there. And that's heartbreaking, and it's where we're at right now. And that's in part what inspires, the ongoing inquiry and experimentation in the best sense of the word, not in the modern sense of the word, the multidimensional, place-based, translineage types of experiments that I think are needed at this time. Yeah, those are kind of main things that come up. Is both the joy of family and also the tragedy of largely the modern shadow, not entirely, but largely of the modern shadow and the reckoning that's happening.
Well, this has been terrific. I enjoy getting to know you better, and also this discussion. I mean, these the cultures and the principles and the needs and the challenges and the ecologies of practice represented by the discussion we've been having are essential to and really underserved in the developmental discussion as it's been happening for the last few decades.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and so glad that we had some time. And thank you for your patience with the broad storytelling. That's I'm learning to become precise, but it's hard to, it's hard to. It's sometimes when there's a lot to paint, and I think sometimes we want to go to the quick, and sometimes people who can do that and still carry with that quickness, the richness and some of the nuance and context is, it's really admirable, and you do that with a lot of skill. So I appreciated that.